Bill, the Gates Foundation is zeroing in on inequality as the greatest obstacle to creating a decent life for people in the world's poorest countries. Why inequality?
Well, we take a lot for granted in the United States and other wealthy countries. The fact that we have enough to eat, the fact that children overwhelmingly survive and their nutrition is such that they're able to be educated and live a full life. Those things are not yet universal. In fact, over 5 million children a year die, and that shouldn't happen. We've made progress. It used to be 10 million a year would die, but the things that we think every human should have are not yet available. So inequality is of a more dramatic and stark form when we look globally.
Now, you're optimistic in part because of the amount of progress that's already been made, right?
That's absolutely right. Because of new vaccines that have been financed so that they can go to all the world's children, these death rates have come down quite dramatically.
And living conditions have improved.
Absolutely. They're not at the level of the US and other rich countries, but 50 years ago, there were poor countries and rich countries. Today, most of the people on Earth live in middle-income countries. So Mexico, China, Brazil, these countries, you do get enough to eat, and you do have a reasonable education system, and the girls get a chance to go to high school. There still are parts of the low middle-income countries and some poor countries where anybody who visits will see such stark deprivation that they feel just from a human moral point of view that the slight amounts we spend to help with that, that we ought to maintain or increase that generosity.
Why are gender and geography the two factors most responsible for the inequality that we're talking about, that you've observed and gathered data on?
Well, the numbers tell that story. If you're born in Finland, you're a 50th as likely to die as a child than if you're born in Niger or a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. That factor of 50, that shouldn't take place. The world is rich enough that the basic medicines, nothing fancy, nothing super expensive, should get to all those children. Likewise, in a lot of countries, girls are still not getting nearly the education or the opportunities that men are. And it's known that when you do that right, it really uplifts everyone. And so it'd be country first. You'd hope to be born in a country that's reasonably well off. And second, you're going to have more opportunities still if you're a boy.
You're absolutely right. The world is more than rich enough to narrow, at the very least, the gap in living conditions, mortality rates, infant mortality rates between the world's wealthiest countries and the world's poorest countries. What would you say, Bill, is the single greatest obstacle to progress on that front?
Well, if the people whose children were dying or had malnutrition were in your neighborhood, then you would immediately, organize a group and step up and, make sure the problem is eliminated. So the challenge is that people don't get an opportunity to go to these countries and see that deprivation. We're hoping to get that story to them and the story of progress. If it's just that you feel guilty and you think, okay, this will never get solved, that's less motivating than realizing that when you help buy a bed net, that literally is saving a child's life. So it's very little money to make these improvements. In general, the kind of foreign aid that enables this is less than 1% of government spending in any country. And even as people are turning a little bit inward, we're hoping to remind them that the moral cause and the benefits of stopping pandemics before they get out of control, the benefits of helping these countries is well worth that less than 1%.
Let's talk about that for a moment. The economic and political conditions that you need to fight inequality are deteriorating. The world appears to be on the verge of a recession, and multilateralism is breaking down. Nationalism is on the rise in many of the world's richest countries. What's that going to mean for the efforts you and others are making?
Well, I wouldn't say that the global economy is actually doing quite well. China has high growth, India has high growth. There are very few countries that are having GDP go down. So the total resources, people are richer today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago by a lot. And because these lower income countries have risen so quickly, actually global inequality has gone down somewhat, although it's still very high. We also have the benefit of science. Science can invent new vaccines, understand malnutrition, and give us tools, new tools that are very, very effective. So the only place that I'm concerned is that political atmosphere. There's more money, there's better science, but if people aren't willing to look at the boys and girls who live outside their country boundaries and say, less than 1% should help lift those countries up, maintain stability there, and help those countries become self-sufficient. So eventually this won't be necessary. The focus on that as a positive thing we should be proud of is a little bit less. And so, all the more reason to talk about the success, talk about the impact, to try and maintain the both moral and strong benefit that comes from global engagement.
How would you describe that political atmosphere today relative to maybe the best place it's been in the past 20 years?
Well, the period that the United States raised its help to poor countries the most was under President Bush. He saw that the AIDS crisis needed an emergency response. On a bipartisan basis, a substantial increase in resources went to that. And that's been amazing. It's saving tens of millions of lives, and that's continued. There have been discussions about cutting that from the administration, but the Congress has said, no, we want to maintain these things we're very proud of. And that if you go to Africa, is recognized as the U.S. absolutely at its best. I will say that domestic distraction and not seeing these people far away as like us and deserving of a tiny bit of our help, that message isn't as common, and yet it's so worthy that we challenge ourselves in terms of our creativity. People want to live a moral existence, and if you can get them to actually visit these places, I've never seen a case where somebody isn't drawn in.
To your point, President Trump has a different attitude toward multilateralism, U.S. interests, and how and where U.S. tax dollars should be spent than his predecessors, Presidents Bush, President Obama, for example, President Clinton. Does that pose a risk to what you're trying to do?
Well, certainly the executive branch picks the key people to run these programs. As yet, the programs are continuing to run. So it's not the worst case here.
Do you worry about that?
Oh, certainly. There's often something that, will say, okay, these are foreigners, should we help them? But when the Congress pushes back, they haven't had to push back very hard, and people say, okay, we'll keep doing these things. So the U.S. still has a lot to be proud of, and for the U.S., it's 0.2%
of government spending.
In that case, GDP. We're about a third as generous as the European countries are. So they often look and say, okay, why doesn't the U.S. do more? We're the biggest in absolute because our economy is so much bigger. So I think this is a story because it's far away, and because the success is not well known. We do have to get better at talking about it to draw people in, because these are solvable problems. We will get an HIV vaccine, we'll get a TB vaccine, a malaria vaccine. The countries in Asia, like Indonesia, Vietnam, India, that used to get a lot of foreign aid, have lifted themselves up. And so they're becoming rich enough that they are self-sufficient. Africa is going to take 20 plus years. It's a much tougher situation, but that's great. Now we get to focus our aid dollars on lifting up those countries.
How long do you think it's going to take before we have an HIV vaccine, before we have a TB vaccine, before we have a malaria vaccine?
Well, in each of those areas, the Gates Foundation's investing hundreds of millions a year. And, I love the scientists doing the work. We've come a long way. So I'm sometimes over-optimistic. But in each case, I'd say in the 10-year time frame, we will have really great vaccines. The progress in understanding biology is advancing. Fortunately, some of the work on cancer that is very well funded gives us insights about how to make vaccines as well. And so that we partner with the companies that work in those areas, and they've been very enthusiastic that they can, as they pursue the cancer, that they can also benefit these poor world conditions. So, we can expect a lot of improvement. Now, if we invent something, we do have to get the funding to get it delivered. When I came into this field, I was stunned. There were a couple vaccines, like one for diarrhea, that was being given to kids in richer countries whose risk of dying was very low, but it wasn't being given in the poor countries. And so we helped create this new vaccine fund that's helped solve that problem.
Why collaborate with the United Nations on sustainable development goals? It's notoriously bureaucratic, and no one would call it efficient.
Well, the United Nations actually isn't even that big. I mean, yes, they fill up that building in New York, but compared to nation-state governments, their budget, the number of people is actually quite small. But there really should be a place where the world comes together and says, okay, what do we care about? Do we care about children dying? Do we care about wars and stopping wars? Do we want nuclear weapons to not be used? Is the environment what's going on, not only with climate change, but particularly with climate change, does that threaten all of us? So we all have to cooperate together. And the previous version, the so-called Millennium Development Goals, those were actually quite successful. And that finished in 2015, and the poverty numbers went down, the death numbers went down. And so a new set of goals that were somewhat broader, like the environmental work was brought in, was blessed actually unanimously by all these members. So that gives it a clear, hey, this is humanity working on the issues that count. And these aren't very controversial things. I mean, telling a mother you don't want her children to die, there's not like one of the countries that thinks that should be a lower priority. Human morality and human values have enough in common. How we govern ourselves, what level of taxes we should have, fine. People can disagree about that. But the idea of preserving nature, letting kids be healthy, that's really enshrined. Now, there's an ambitious goal. The deadline for this one is 2030. It'll be hard to reach that, but there's constant improvement. And our foundation every year takes the time of the General Assembly saying, okay, we don't think about the poor countries much. This is the one time of year, let's see what's going well, let's see what's behind, let's celebrate the heroes, whether it's scientists with new tools or people in the field, and really give some visibility to what is the report card for humanity.
Let's talk about climate change, Bill. You believe that climate change poses an even greater threat to the people in poor countries than it does to the people in rich countries, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If you can't afford air conditioning, if when your crop fails you don't have a savings account to get past that 1 year in 8, and so your children aren't having enough to eat, if you live near the equator where The absolute temperature is far higher than it is in the temperate zones. Climate change is caused by middle income and rich people, but the people who suffer by far the most will be the poor. So it's very unjust. Even eventually, for the wealthy people, the problems will be very, very bad. But for the next 30, 40 years, most of it will hurt the subsistence farmer.
Why focus your efforts at the foundation on mitigation and adaptation to climate change instead of combating the root problem, carbon emissions?
Well, mitigation is not an area that the foundation gets involved in. That's where you're trying to switch to green energy or electric cars or meat that is made without cows. That's big private sector stuff.
And you invest in that.
I invest, billions in those things, including, nuclear reactors and all sorts of things to help there. Adaptation, which is taking the fact that there will be climate problems, and we need to help those who are hurt by it by giving them better seeds that can deal with the drought or that are more productive so you can save more money. Those things the foundation is very, very involved in. And most people think about this mitigation of reducing emissions, the idea of how you minimize the damage, which they call adaptation, that gets very little attention. And that's why I and a few others, Bon Ki-moon and a really great group of people, created a commission about this adaptation issue that later this year, that it'll make it more clear that there's work to be done there.
Do you think climate change is stoppable or maybe even reversible at some point?
Well, we're not going to have a year where the world is cooler than it is today. The temperature, the average global temperature is going to go up a lot. And in the next 50 years, it won't go down. Now, deciding how much it goes up, does it go up by 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees, that's in our hands. If we ignore the problem, you're going to aim head to something that's like a 4-degree scenario, which in terms of natural ecosystems, forest fires, days that humans just can't go outside if you live near the equator, it's pretty extreme case. Knowing how seriously people are going to take it and what type of innovations will come along will determine where in that 2 to 4 degree range we are by the end of the century. And I certainly hope we don't run the experiment of being higher than 2 degrees, but it will take a lot of commitment and a bit of luck on the innovative breakthroughs to be able to get there.
There are a number of different ways of fighting climate change. Renewable energy is clearly one of them. Do you think governments should subsidize renewable energy or should take-up be dictated by market forces alone?
Well, the cost of wind and solar has come down dramatically, and some of that subsidization has helped drive that volume, which drives the learning curve, and the prices come down. Now they're not going to come down much more. So the tax benefits there should be shifted into things that are more limiting, like energy storage, offshore wind, which still has a huge premium price, lots of places that we need the market to get going. The progress in solar and wind is very helpful, but the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. If you're far away from the equator, actually in the winter, you can't get as much. And so, and that's just for the electricity piece, that's only 25% of emissions. So we need a lot of efforts. But yes, that subsidization, that accelerated rollout, that's one of the few advances we had. It's less than 10% of all energy generation, because the global economy has a lot of energy generation. But it's one of the good things that has been developed.
Bill, some people would ask, why should I care about global inequality when at least here in the United States, domestic inequality is such a persistent and growing problem?
Well, there's no doubt that over 99% of the money in the U.S. that the U.S. government spend should go to domestic inequality. Now we should be smart about how we spend that to improve schools, to perhaps improve income tax credit, huge number of things we should be debating to use that money well. The fact that this way less than 1% should go to help stop epidemics, to create stability, to help those in need, I think that case can be made. Nobody's suggesting that you go over 1% in terms of helping those who are the poorest.
You've told me before that a progressive income tax structure is the best way to fight the inequality problem here in the United States, a redistribution of resources, if you will. And if anything, our tax regime should be more progressive. You still feel that way, right?
Well, the government is spending more than it takes in. So at some point, even for the current safety net and programs, somebody's going to pay more in taxes. And I do think that should be done in a progressive fashion. Just fixing the taxes alone, is a big help, but you also want the impact of that government spending to really learn, why are kids dropping out of college? It's not the case that affordability is the only problem in U.S. higher education. And for some cases it is, but I wouldn't even put that at the top of the list.
Now that so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of so few, some people say that a wealth tax, not an income tax, is the only way to properly tackle the inequality problem. Could you get behind a wealth tax?
I wouldn't be against a wealth tax. Unless you get a lot of nations cooperating and deal with some of the problems like people leaving the country, or how do you do these valuations that can get quite complicated, and if you have to do that every year. But if the society got behind a wealth tax, yes, you can raise money that way. Not many countries do it. In fact, Europe has less today than it had before, partly because if you're a small country, the issue of people leaving, changing their residence is a fairly big issue. In general, I'm for way more financial transparency. I don't like that you can have trusts where nobody knows who owns it. Whenever you talk about all this money that moves around and, what did it pay taxes? Is that criminal money? We should have a lot more transparency. So I doubt, the U.S. will do a wealth tax, but I wouldn't be against it. The closest thing we have to it is the estate tax, and there I've been a huge proponent that that should go back to the level 55% that it was a few decades ago.
Tax refugees are a real issue. What would you say to your fellow billionaires, and in some cases millionaires, who reject the idea of progressive taxation and increasingly are relocating, at the very least under the current regime, to states where they don't have to pay as much tax?
Yeah, so the biggest issue about this would be if people are actually leaving the country altogether. There you could have something like an exit tax, certainly for their U.S. assets. Within the U.S., there's a fair bit of zero-sum competition, both for individuals and for businesses, where if somebody's going to place some jobs, then gigantic money gets spent to them. I think a lot of that the states should sit down and sort of declare a truce in terms of how that money gets spent. We're never going to totally align the income tax regime across the 50 states, but if they would move towards the middle in some way, that would be helpful. There are jurisdictions that are getting to a point where it really does become that they're not helping themselves by raising the rate.
We're talking about places like perhaps New Jersey or Connecticut, the ones where most people seem to be fleeing?
Yeah, I don't keep track of who's got the very highest rate now. There are states whose balance sheet is very troublesome in terms of the liabilities they have, and it's too bad we're not really facing up to those and saying, okay, what is the plan for New Jersey or Illinois, over the next several decades? to get out of the financial difficulty they're in. Puerto Rico's the most extreme.
I want to ask you about philanthropy. As a matter of principle, most people would agree that more philanthropy is a good thing. But as you well know, there's a big difference between good or effective philanthropy and bad or ineffective philanthropy. Of the billionaires you know, and they happen to be the people who tend to give away in aggregate the most money, how many would you say are doing a good job of that?
I don't know all the different philanthropy that different people are doing. We do have this group called the Giving Pledge, where now a couple hundred people have committed to giving the majority of their money away. And there are regular meetings, one annual meeting to talk broadly about the topic, and then through the course of the year, lots of meetings that are focused on giving to science, giving to education, giving to the environment. And I know people are learning a lot from each other. There are some very sophisticated givers, and the heterogeneity is such that you'll never have a single score. I mean, George Soros did brilliant work helping the Eastern European countries, build up a civil society. That was kind of amazing, hard to measure. People like Rich Kinder and his wife are giving in Houston and creating these parks, and it's fantastic. There are, I'd say, in the Giving Pledge, there are at least 30 philanthropists that I've learned a lot from. Starting with people like Eli Broad, who've been at it for many decades. Michael Bloomberg, who's incredible in what he does. I hate if I mention names now, I'm leaving various people out. But I've learned from these people, and that's partly why I look forward to that event. So the big givers should be very careful. They should put the same care into it that they put into creating the wealth.
No one would accuse you and Melinda of not giving away enough money. But one of the reasons you've been able to be so generous is by investing well. And I wonder, at this stage of the game, are you and Melinda and your investment chief, Michael Larson, as focused as you have been on generating returns so that the foundation has more money to give away? And for that matter, your private investments, or is now a time to think more about capital preservation?
Well, I'm bullish on the U.S. businesses and global businesses. So we're not in some defensive posture where we're mostly in cash or anything like that. The strategy that's been used on the investments is to be over 60% in equities, and
that's still the case?
No, that's still the case, and
even after a 10-year bull run?
Well, yeah, you can. Well, calling market turns is a very tough thing to do. You can make the case that the yields aren't very high, but that's true across all asset classes. I mean, T-bills at 10-year, well less than 2%. So there's no obvious thing to beat other investors out there, and there's reasons to think absolute returns for the next decade will be less than they have been for the last several decades.
The government has opened up an antitrust review of big tech, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. Do you still believe it's better to regulate these companies than to break them up? And if so, why?
Well, break up, I don't know the last time a company was broken up. It's I think quite a long time ago. And you have to really think, is that the best thing? If there's a way the company's behaving that you want to get rid of, then you should just say, okay, that's a banned behavior.
Stop
just
doing that.
splitting a company in two and having two people doing the bad thing, that doesn't seem like a solution. So it's a pretty narrow set of things that I think breakup is the right answer to. These companies are very big, very important companies. So the fact that governments are thinking about these things, that's not a surprise. I was naive about this, but that it was a long time ago, and I didn't realize that as Microsoft gets successful, we'd come under scrutiny, and we went through our thing back in the 90s, and that's made us more thoughtful about this kind of activity.
Do you share the government's concerns that any one of these companies, or all of them perhaps, are doing things, abusing their power and influence in such a way that it undermines either the political system, and we've heard about that, or perhaps the consumer economy, and we've heard about that too?
I think these companies are behaving totally legally. They're doing a lot of innovative things. The fact that the tax rules incent you to structure in a certain way and to minimize your taxes. People should look if they want to change that going forward. That's a real question. Social media, nobody had a crystal ball that in some ways that would be a way of sort of radicalizing people or splitting them into different groups. What exactly the solution to that should be, to have us more reading a common front page and not being pulled to extremes, I don't think you can rely completely on the tech industry to worry about that enough, come up with the solutions. I do think government really needs to talk about what those rules should be. So it's not, you could say I'm biased, but I see these as well-meaning, highly innovative companies that it's up to society to make sure that their innovation doesn't have negative side effects.